and welcome to the Ended Up in Vegas podcast. I'm Nikki.
I'm Megan.
Today we have a topic that affects everyone, marriage and divorce. And Las Vegas is definitely a place known for both. Ed Kainen, you are a renowned divorce attorney. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
So tell us how you ended up in Vegas.
Well, it's kind of a tortured story. I started out when I was a young lawyer, 35 plus years ago, as a criminal prosecutor. It's what I always wanted to do. And I was practicing in Tampa. Okay. I was trying cases, learning, all the things that go into that. In like 5 years, I tried like 100 plus jury trials and got a lot of experience and everything. And then what I learned the hard way was that the offices are very political. And so the state attorney that I worked for lost an election. Mm-hmm. And about the top 30% of the office were required to interview for their positions. And the vast majority of us were shown the door, said, hey, don't let it hit you in the butt on the way out. Mm-hmm. So I ended up going to a different state attorney's office, but it was enough that it got my attention that I said I wanted to change. And in Florida, there's so many lawyers. I mean, hundreds of thousands of lawyers. You can't throw a dead cat without hitting a lawyer. And a buddy of mine came to Vegas in the late 80s, mid 80s, and he told me, he said, look, the streets here are paved with gold. Mm-hmm. Pick up and come. And I came out on a trip. I loved it. Picked up a bar application while I was here, took the bar, and a year later, I moved to Vegas.
Wow.
And I've been here since.
And that was when?
That was in 1993.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. So when did you start practicing family law?
In 93, when I came here, I was ready for a wholesale change. I had swallowed the Kool-Aid as a prosecutor, so I didn't want to do criminal defense. Uh-huh. And it meant picking up a whole new area. So when I came out here, I was looking for something different. I wanted to get the lay of the land, so I took a job as a law clerk, and it happened to be in a family court department.
Okay.
I learned family law, and it worked out really well because most law clerks are out of school for like 15 minutes, mm-hmm. and they really don't know a whole lot. Well, I came in having 6 or 7 years of practice. I had, 100 plus jury trials under my belt. It wasn't hard to stand out. And the guy who was the top family lawyer in Las Vegas took me to lunch, and kind of the rest was history. We were partners for a lot of years, and then when he was older and when he started easing into retirement, we separated the practices, and I continued our practice and I grew it.
Wow. So what was there anything particular that drew you to the law?
I was one of those kids. I only had one other vocation I considered before I was going to be a lawyer. I knew I was going to be a lawyer by 5 years old.
Oh my gosh.
The only other thing I considered was being a sanitation worker in New York.
Okay.
And that was because as a 5-year-old kid in New York City, you see people who get to hang on the side of a truck.
Right.
I mean, that was pretty cool. But once I got past that, I think by 5 or 6, I knew I was going to be a lawyer, and I never wavered from it.
Did you grow up in New York City?
I did. Well, on Long Island and everything.
Okay.
New York City when I was very young, but mostly on the island, and then moved to Florida, and then here.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I love New York.
Yeah. And then this Las Vegas, I feel like, becomes a, very closely knit group of people who are from both of those places.
There is a strange migration that we followed. I would have never imagined in a million years I would be in Vegas, mm-hmm. or be a divorce lawyer for that matter. And they both have done very well.
So you're an elected fellow of the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers.
Yeah.
So what is distinctively qualifying about that position?
So the Academy, it's what's called, there's the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers. The AAML is probably the top 1,500, 1,600 family lawyers in the country. Okay. Requires all sorts of qualifications to get in. It's not like doctors who you see are fellows of, whatever, diplomats of whatever mm-hmm. board, where it's just part of the practice. Here, there are only 20 elected Academy Fellows in the state, wow. and honestly, 5 of them are in my firm. So it's beyond the good housekeeping seal of approval. It's the top lawyers in the country.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so we're hearing from someone who's very qualified to be speaking on this today.
Oh, well, thanks.
So tell us, what is unique about the state of Nevada? We all know you can get married very quickly here, and we're known for a quickie divorce. Right. Tell us about those laws.
So it's interesting. The quickie divorce thing goes back to like 1927 to 1931 when the laws were in flux. Before that, from I think 1864 or whatever it was, we had a standard residency requirement like everybody else, where you had to live someplace for 6 months before you were eligible to file for divorce. And in 1927, they moved it from 6 months to 3 months. And then I think by 31, they moved it to 6 weeks or 42 days.
Oh, wow.
And honestly, it was a financial boom, but it was mostly drawn to get the attention of the California entertainment industry or the wealthy Californians. And so what people would do, because really Las Vegas wasn't really, it was a train stop at that point. Right. So it was really Reno in that area, Reno and Tahoe. And what happened was they would set up these spas where people would come and they would stay for 6 weeks. They would do their summer vacation. They would get their divorces and they would go back to wherever they were from. And so Reno, the biggest little city in the world, became the divorce capital of the world.
Yeah.
And Nevada's never changed that 6-week residency requirement. We're the only state, as far as I know, that has that short a residency requirement.
Is that right? Okay. What would you say is the most common? Is it still 6 months in most states? Or?
Most states are still 6 months, yeah.
Okay.
And there's different requirements and different, I mean, look, we don't really encourage people to come here for 6 weeks, get a divorce, and go somewhere else. Sure. Now there's part of it is an intent to remain for an indefinite period and things like that. So it's really not what it was back then. But it is still very easy for someone to relocate here and get a divorce. Because of different jurisdictional rules, Nevada may not have jurisdiction to decide custody of children who aren't here. There are different time limits on that. There are a lot of uniform laws, but the marriage itself could literally be ended after 6 weeks of residence.
Yeah, I think for someone who really wants it and wants it done easy, that's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
So we've both been divorced, and we've gone through different experiences. I represented myself, my ex-spouse. We were, without attorneys. We did all of the work ourselves. You used an attorney.
I did.
So, and yours took quite a bit longer, was messier. So there are obviously huge disparities in, transaction to transaction, what that looks like. So give us what do you see most commonly in Nevada? Are we known for being a state that favors one party over the other? And how do judges here, prefer to give custody and all of those things, split assets?
Depending on who you talk to, if you talk to some women, they'll say it's a man's state. If you talk to certain men, it'll say it's a women's state, all those kind of things. And really none of that is true. It's so much information that's out there is really just anecdotal. People know what they know. What has become really common is unrepresented parties in family court are clearly a very, very common kind of thing. I think somebody said there were like 90% of cases, or maybe it was 90% of cases, or some ridiculously high number, had at least one unrepresented party.
Really?
It used to be like 50 or 60%. It just depends what you do. If you have the simplest of things where you have two people with nothing to divide and no kids, then you know what? The divorce itself isn't that hard to do. But if you have anything of value, if you have children and you have any sort of disagreement, then it really helps to be represented by a lawyer, at least get the advice of a lawyer to find out what your risks are, what's in play, and those kind of things.
Yeah.
I mean, I consider myself a reasonably intelligent person, but I was like, there's no way I could do this paperwork on my own.
It's beyond the paperwork.
Yeah,
it's just there are so many. The hard part about divorce is everybody knows these anecdotal stories, from your hairdresser or your mechanic or whatever it is, or some guy at work or somebody else whose cousin's brother went through something. And the reality is that everybody knows these little snippets, but until it's like a real estate transaction. There are so many moving parts, and it's not like they're all standalone. It's not like they all are levers that you switch one direction or another. This one's yes, this one's no. Every one of them affects something else, and that's why it really makes a difference when you have someone who knows how all of the parts move together.
I think having the right attorney, and because divorces are so complex, is so important. And I consulted with quite a few, hired one, and I lead a divorce support group, so I get exposed to a lot of that anecdotal information, and it's so critical to how the divorce goes, to having the right attorney. And maybe not even the right attorney is going to be the right attorney for every person. There's different personality types and situations, and not all attorneys are going to be well matched for every person.
Yeah, look, one of the things that's nice is, I spend a lot of time right now at this point in my career. I'm the rainmaker for the practice, so I do a lot of speaking with prospective clients, deciding, realistically, it's a lot of people who think they're interviewing me. The reality is we're interviewing the clients to see who we're going to let in the door.
Yeah.
But what you learn is, and people are, we'll share a lot of information, including who else they're shopping. And one of the nice things I get to do is be able to look at a client who's done some due diligence or at least gone to a good source, gotten really good names. So when they tell me, well, I'm also speaking with so-and-so and so-and-so, you sit there and you're able to say to someone, you know what? Any of the lawyers on your list will be great lawyers. And so you get to the point where it goes to that next level of you have to find the lawyer that's right for you. And I tell clients all the time, sometimes it's that feeling in the pit of your stomach. Do you connect with this person? Do you trust them? Because the relationship between a divorce client and a lawyer is really about as intimate a relationship as you're going to get, because divorce lawyers, in order to do their job, really need to know a lot of stuff about you. They're going to go, anything that two people in a marriage could find themselves into is going to find their way into that divorce lawyer's office. So you've got to be comfortable sharing. And the only way a divorce lawyer can give you good advice is to really know all the information.
Absolutely.
So you've got to be comfortable sharing. You've got to be comfortable trusting. And that only comes if you are comfortable with that person. So if you don't have that feeling in the pit of your stomach, I tell clients all the time, if you look at it and say, look, this guy just isn't right for me, then we're not right for each other, because you've got to be able to trust the team you've got representing you.
What are some of the mistakes that you see people make when hiring an attorney or going into the divorce process?
Oh, there are so many. It's kind of like we were talking about a second ago. It's that anecdotal evidence, knowing one piece, but not knowing how the moving parts fit together. The other thing is trying to do things on their own and not realizing that attempt to save money at the beginning can often be the most costly thing they do. And it's like, compare it to a real estate transaction. If you opened a real estate, if you have a client who opened a real estate transaction by going to see the opposing realtor and saying, well, I'm willing to pay up to X or whatever it is, are they ever going to get a piece of property for less than that? There are certain things you don't. So when people start negotiations, they don't realize that they create floors and ceilings that they can never roll back from.
Right.
So oftentimes what is a really legitimate attempt to avoid conflict becomes a very costly mistake. It's the same way. Look, as a young person, it took me a long time to realize that in a real estate transaction, I don't know, giving away 6% of the whole deal if I'm a seller, or those kind of things. Wow, that sounds like a lot of money. Well, look, after having done that now quite a few times, it's a bargain, but people don't realize that until they've been down, and until they realize what they don't know. And that's the hard part. Most people don't know what they don't know.
100%. Yeah. They focus on this little piece of the pie, and they don't realize how much they don't know about the whole process. Interesting.
I do think, though, that one element of it is that I've learned from having experienced it, and I divorced the same person twice. So
there we go. We call you a frequent flyer.
Second time I've confessed that on this podcast. But from what I learned the first time through consulting with an attorney, hiring an attorney, was that a lot of it is so emotional, and you do so much work through, making the attorney your mediator. Is if you can just transcend from that position. Obviously it's dependent upon your soon-to-be ex-spouse, right? But what's the best tip you can do to save money? We know this is a very expensive process.
So ironically, what I'm going to tell you is the best way to save money is to find the very best lawyer you can afford.
Okay.
Do your homework on it. It's the same thing. Like I said, our businesses are there's a lot of symbiotic relationships.
Yeah.
Better trained, more experienced lawyers do a better job. It just comes from experience. And you're going to talk to different people who had different experiences. If you look at a broad perspective on who the best lawyers are, generally the best lawyers have more than enough business. So there's no incentive to grind a case and to squeeze every case like it's a lemon trying to get the last drop out of it. For me and for our firm, what we want to do is we want to get our cases done more efficiently, or as efficiently as we can. First of all, it dispels a lot of the negative stereotypes. But we, because family law is an hourly process. It's
Right.
not a flat fee kind of thing. So, like in your business, you want to get as many transactions through as you can. Time on desk, you want to minimize time on desk and things like that and process transactions, because the more volume equals more money. In ours, we're limited by the amount of hours in a week.
Sure.
So the amount of time we can do something efficiently and get 3 cases done really efficiently, and as opposed to one that is, takes a long time. And we have 3 clients who go out there and say, wow, these guys were really good and they did a great job and they did it in an economically efficient way. Then I've got 3 people out there who are saying, wow, these lawyers are really good.
Yeah.
I think that's really meaningful. And I there is definitely perception that attorneys want to drag it out. But I think from my own perspective, it seemed more like it was caseload management. And if some attorneys, especially the attorney I used, was an individual and had her own practice. And I think it was just a capacity issue to getting things done. And that's what I think part of what took so long.
Well, like I said, some people have good time management skills. Some people don't. I mean, I think that's an essential factor in being able to represent people well. You've got to be cognizant of deadlines. You've got to know how to process. You've got to have a lot of balls in the air at the same time. But that's just one of the skills. You have to be able to work with other lawyers. There's in every case, there are 4 moving parts, 4 players in there.
Sure.
Any one of them, it's sort of like that old phrase about, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link.
Right.
For it to go smoothly and properly, you need all 4 folks working together.
Sure.
And at least with both lawyers, you need both lawyers on the same, on the same mission. If you have somebody who's just out to make the process more expensive or whatever it is, that person can slow everybody down. And that's the hard part, is that if you get 2 good lawyers involved in a case, they're looking to move on and get it done and do the best they can for their clients. They both realize one party is not getting everything they want. It requires some compromise. And so we're both, at the same time we're out there fighting like hell for our clients, we're talking to our clients to prepare them for, we may have to give this or give that or whatever it is. And you can't spend, I remember a case years ago where I had a valuation professional who wanted to spend, 10 or 20,000 fighting over a $3,000 waste issue. I mean, it just doesn't make any economic sense. So you got to keep your eye on the ball.
Yeah. What are some things that an individual who's going to go into a divorce or is looking at attorneys, what are some questions they can ask, or how can they determine if someone's right for them?
I think you want to look at credentials as a starting point. To me, that's a matter of, there are certain things that objectively require a knowledge, require skill and experience. So if you start in Nevada with the idea of board certification.
Okay.
There are 40 or 50 or maybe probably 50 plus or minus board certified family law specialists in Nevada. So if you start with one of those lawyers, now that doesn't mean every one of them, doesn't mean I love every one of them, doesn't mean they're all the best lawyers in the world, but they have a minimum level of qualification that puts them in the category of probably the top 3, 4, 5% of family lawyers in the state. So if you start with that list on the State Bar website, you're not going to be dealing with someone who is just dabbling in family law. You guys know dabblers in real estate.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you start with that as your basis. You're going to be dealing with people who at least minimum have a certain number of years of experience. They've tested, they've passed the specialization test, they've gotten the certification, and they are broadly qualified to be able to handle it. Same kind of thing we talked about before. If you get into that level, then the person's going to be qualified. Beyond that, maybe it's personality or something like that. If you want to take it up a notch, then you look to academy membership and those kind of things. So there are other levels of qualification where you narrow down the 50 best family lawyers in the state, or the 50 most qualified or credentialed family lawyers in the state. Maybe you narrow it down to 20, maybe you narrow it down to 10, depending on what you've got in play.
That's really helpful. I wish I had some of that information back when I was picking an attorney. I think some of the things I wish I'd known is to ask up front, like what to expect in communication.
Sure.
Really understanding how often and how frequent I should expect communication, and how best to make sure that the person I was hiring had a similar communication style, and that I would be up to the snuff is not the word I want to think of, but kind of just knowing what's
Your
going
expectations.
on.
Yeah. Look, everybody has, a lot of that is stylistic more than anything else. And that gets into the sort of, is there a connection between people? Are they going to be able to work well together? You know, look, in our office, we have a hard policy that says every email, every phone call is returned within 24 hours. But if one of my lawyers is in a mediation or a trial, he may not be able to return that call, but somebody from the office should. There's also a chain of, I don't call it chain of command, it's probably the wrong way to do it, but you have a list of people that you can talk to. So if one lawyer isn't available, any lawyer in my office isn't available, I'm going to know enough about the case to be able to field a question and be able to help a client in the absence of their lawyer if someone's unavailable. So understanding, you know, access to lawyers, access to paralegals, access to other lawyers in the firm. You know, we have an answering service, 24-hour answering service. I don't like giving out my cell phone.
Right, sure.
But we have an answering service, so the phone rolls over. Our answering service asks two questions. Are you a current client of the firm? Do you need to speak to someone? If the answer to the first is yes, they'll track down or get a message to whoever it is.
Okay. Yeah.
What are some things that people who live in Nevada or are moving to Nevada should know about community property laws and what belongs to who when they move here, get married, or are in a long-term relationship with someone?
So, like, the unique things about Nevada, probably the confluence of two different concepts that people don't always have a real firm understanding of. First is no-fault divorce, and second is community property law. So take them one by one. No-fault divorce is simply the abolition of what was called fault divorce for years. So it used to be that in a very patriarchal system, there had to be a reason to get divorced. You had to prove infidelity. You had to prove cruelty or whatever it is, abandonment, and all of those kind of words that get thrown around. In a no-fault divorce state, it doesn't mean people haven't done horrible things or that. What it means is that's not a prerequisite, because not only did you have to prove those things to get through the threshold of obtaining a divorce, because society said we don't really approve of divorce, so we're not going to let you get divorced. Not only do you have to prove it, but if you prove those things, and in states that still have fault-based divorce, there are consequences to that kind of conduct. So, for example, if somebody had an affair, there might be a consequence that says, hey, you can't have custody of your kids, or that you can't, or what was really common for a long time is if a woman had an affair, she wasn't eligible to receive alimony. Now, depending on which side of that coin you're on, you may say, oh, that's good or that's not good. But the reality is that if you remove fault from the equation, then we make it a purely economic equation that says, look, alimony, for example, is going to be determined based on the length of the marriage, the earning capacities of the parties, and all of this. We're not getting into this, who had a relationship with their trainer at the gym kind of thing. Custody of the kids should be determined by certain presumptions and who's the best parent and those kind of things, not by some arbitrary check the box kind of thing. So that's your fault divorce. Community property is really honestly a pretty simple concept. What it says is when you're married, anything that you acquire based on your labors and efforts is ours, not mine. And so when I work and my wife is at home, doesn't mean because I earn the money, it's my money. It's still our money because I earned it based on my labors and efforts during the marriage. So it gets away from that. In other words, you become a team, not individuals who just happen to be connected by vows.
Right. Yeah.
Well, you get those two together, and divorce should be relatively simple. Now, then you look at that and you say, if we have these concepts are out there, then figuring out what happens in a divorce should be a pretty simple thing.
Right?
And the reality is, in most cases, it really is. A good lawyer can look at a case once you know all the facts and be able to tell you within a certain margin what the outcome is likely to be. Now, there are lots of other factors that come in. Well, I had this asset before I was married, but I paid on it after I was married. So I used premarital money and then I used community money. And so there are certainly wrinkles that come in, but two good divorce lawyers can size up a case. I love having a good divorce lawyer. Everyone gets
Yeah.
nervous, like, oh, should I go talk to other lawyers and make sure they can't represent my spouse? I'm like, no, I
Yeah.
want a good lawyer on the other
Right.
side because they have the ability to size up a case and they'll know what it's worth. And I'm more likely to be able to settle a case with them.
Well, that's
Yeah.
good to know.
And psychologically, I think, you're breaking an agreement. So I think it's most difficult in the situation where you're like, well, all the agreements we had are kind of going out the window and then everything gets fuzzy around that, So we talked a little bit about, what you learned. I think that was the title, What You Learned in Marriage, or What You Learned in Marriage Will Teach You About Divorce. Is
Or
that
what
the
you
title?
learned from divorce will teach you about marriage.
That. So, what are some hard and fast rules of, someone who's approaching divorce, especially when it comes to property? I think we know one of them, which is don't abandon your house, right?
Generally good advice, at least from a starting perspective.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, the little asterisk that always goes to that is don't put yourself in danger. If there's a
Right.
domestic
Of
violence
course.
situation, get out, stay safe, do what's necessary. But if you're going to get out because of a domestic violence situation, get into a lawyer ASAP, because sometimes the walking away from the house because of a domestic violence situation, if there's a short window, it becomes easy to flip that script and get somebody back in there.
Right.
Another thing that would become really important is make yourself aware of the economics of the marriage. In so many marriages, one person handles most or all of the economics of a marriage.
Right.
In my marriage, that's the way it is. I handle the reality, and as much as I counsel women all day long, and I have for 30 years, you have to stay in the loop. You have to know these kind of things.
Yeah.
You have to be aware of where the money is and how it's invested. I can't get my wife to really have a very strong interest in that. And so what I started doing years ago, still do it to this day, is I have a spreadsheet that's about 2 or 3 pages that lists every asset we have, the account number, if it's an investment account, who manages it, the cars, the real estate, how everything is held, whatever, any asset we have, the life insurance policies, who's the agent, all of that kind of stuff is on this spreadsheet. And about every 2 or 3 months, I print out an updated copy of it, and it gets folded up and it's on the top shelf of the safe at home. Because if I get hit by a bus, at least you'll have current information.
Yeah.
Or it was current within the last few months. Now, that's not the ideal way to do it, especially if you're I'm going to use the phrase, the out spouse.
Right.
The spouse not in control. It really is important to be able to stay as aware of your economics as you can. I mean, and again, it's not always possible in every relationship, and I can't stick my nose into how everybody does things, but being aware of things certainly makes a divorce easier if you know where your assets are, what they're invested in, what you own and what you owe, those sort of things. That makes it a lot easier.
I think that's what I'm referring to, though, is what gets fuzzy in divorce when you do have that agreement in your marriage and then it doesn't correlate to the divorce because now you're breaking the agreement and one person seems to think that they have more ownership in in that list of things. So, I mean, how do you approach that? Like when you get one side who, I think we're going to talk in a second about kind of the gender specific problems that come with divorce, but specifically for women who the agreement was the wife is going to stay home, she's mothering the children, she's taking time away from the workplace, even though she's working at home. We all know that.
Right.
But then, you come to divorce and it's not seen to have the value that it did in the marriage.
So I don't, and again, I'm going to impose my values here. I don't think, and my wife was at home for a lot of certainly the last 20 years of our marriage, or the better part of the last 20 years of our marriage. But I don't think that working at home should deprive you of necessarily understanding the inner workings, the economics of the marriage. Even though I'm the one going to an office every day.
Yeah, of course not.
I think it's incumbent upon people to stay aware of how the economics are handled.
Of course.
So that's a starting point. To go more to what you're talking about, Nikki, though, is if suddenly at some point in the marriage the deal is changing, that to me is a red flag. And it's a red flag to do a couple of things. And so if we're talking about, let's take a more traditional marriage where you've got the husband who's working and you've got the wife at home, but the wife has been in the loop financially, and now some switch has changed, and all of a sudden she's sort of blocked out on knowing things, that's a huge red flag. So to me, that's the time where you start trying to acquire some knowledge about where the economics are. It becomes, opening mail, or at least looking, if you don't have the stones to open the mail, at least looking at the envelopes to see what brokerages they're coming from and things like that, so at least you know where to look. It means you've got to get off the dime and not let it fester for a long time, because the longer, a little anecdote here, Johnny Carson we could talk about legal separation. Johnny Carson once defined legal separation as the extra time you give the husband to hide the money. So the point is if you start seeing these red flags, it's time to act. It's time to start, in a Machiavellian way, protecting yourself. So it means gathering information. It means, okay, maybe I'm going to attempt marriage counseling and make a sincere effort, but it also means playing some cards close to your vest as you assemble information and begin to at least acquire the knowledge to be able to protect yourself. It means maybe quietly talking to a divorce lawyer, not because you want to be divorced.
Sure.
I mean, I can't tell you how many times I meet with people just so they understand what it looks like. There's a difference when you're I grew up with public pools in New York. I would rather have a discussion with somebody about what it's like to dive off the high diving board when I was entering the pool rather than when I was at the tip of that board.
Right.
So don't wait until the very end, until you have no other consequence. If you want to know what divorce is going to look like, don't get that advice from your nail person. Get that advice from a divorce lawyer who can say to you, look, I understand you're not ready. We're not, and by the way, most divorce lawyers aren't looking to sell you on getting divorced, but they're going to be able to educate you on, okay, in your situation, here's what's going on. These are the economic things you should be doing. This is what child custody might come out looking like. This is what guideline support for children is. This is what alimony might be in your situation. So we're going to be able to tell you with rough estimates what a divorce looks like. That doesn't mean we're saying to you, oh, quick, sign a retainer and let's go forward and let's sort of like tear up the whole world. It means now you can make an informed decision rather than sort of just having this story about your best girlfriend's brother's, landscaper who went through a divorce and got custody of his kids.
Sure.
Don't you think there's some psychology? Maybe I'm wrong, but some people are resistant. I know I was resistant to meet with a divorce attorney until I probably did it too late.
Yeah.
It's almost like it's a step that they don't want to take unless they're 100% sure it's going to go in that direction.
Agreed.
Yeah.
No, and that's unfortunate because it does come with the stigma that once I go see a divorce attorney, I've thrown in the towel or whatever it is. I mean, I can just tell you the experience that my clients have, and it's not like that. It really is an educational kind of thing. Now, there are certain things that are hard in a marriage. The first time somebody throws out the D word, that's something you can't pull back. But getting educated, especially if you're honestly, if you're either spouse, but especially if you're the disadvantaged spouse, is critical to making decisions. It's critical to renegotiating. We go back to your example where it's like somebody's flipped a switch and things have changed. Well, if we're going to right that ship again in marriage counseling or some negotiation with our spouse, we want to know what the alternative looks like, what's expected, what's reasonable. A lot of folks who are in the situation, I refer to it as a foxhole mentality because their whole universe becomes that situation they live in. Whether it's domestic violence and they begin to normalize it, or being shouted at, or being treated poorly, or not having economic information, or being on an allowance, or you can come up with all sorts of different things that are not the norm. But when you live in it for so long, it becomes your norm.
Absolutely.
And we know that the more those kind of things go on, because they're not normal, the spouse imposing those kind of things tends to isolate the other spouse from the kind of things that would teach them that behavior isn't normal. So getting an education is really, really key.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's anything people should do? Because I think, I went into marriage very idealistic, prenuptial agreements or postnuptial agreements. And in hindsight, there are things I probably should have done before I got married and maybe even during reconciliation when we separated. Is that something that you advocate for?
So, look, I'm a believer in marriage.
Yeah.
I really am. My wife and I have been married for we're both divorced.
Okay.
We're both divorced 30 years ago.
Okay.
We're married for 20 plus years. And I really believe in marriage. If two people get married when they are, young kids and don't have anything, and they're similarly situated, then probably a prenup isn't the most required thing in the world. Mm-hmm. When you get into people in their 40s and 50s, for example, who are getting married a second time, and there are differences in children. One has children, one doesn't. Both have children, and they come to the marriage with different assets or different expectations. One has acquired wealth, one hasn't. One is going to stay home while the other is going to work. There are a lot of financial considerations to those decisions. And honestly, the prenup oftentimes is protecting the outspouse. Mm-hmm. If I'm getting married in my 40s and I have an established law practice and I'm making a good living, and I'm marrying someone who's 10 years younger than me and wants to have children and wants to stay home, and we agree to that, well, she's going to be giving up a career. Mm-hmm. She's not going to be able to work. Isn't it fair to be able to say, look, in the event this doesn't work out 15 years down the road, now I've grown my career because you've taken care of these things. You have no career. Maybe there should be some disproportionate division, either maybe of assets or a certain guaranteed amount that someone has to start out that may not impact the wealth I've acquired before we were married, but certainly reflects the fact that we're going to keep wealth separate afterwards. I mean, there are a lot of things that go into that.
Yeah, I think that's really beneficial for people to know. I think it seems like a scary thing, or like it's like the antidote to love, but...
Well, there's a buddy of mine is a devout Catholic, and before he got married, he had to go through all sorts of counseling through the church. Mm-hmm. And I used to think, wow, that's kind of crazy and everything. Now I kind of look at it and I say, you know what? There are topics that two blissful people in love will never talk about until they rear their heads. Sometimes talking about those in advance and finding out if you guys are on the same page before you get married is really kind of critically important.
Yeah.
Making sure your values are together. And it's beyond just, we love each other. There's religious differences. There's economic savers and spenders. I mean, there's all sorts of things that are potential pitfalls in marriages.
Yeah.
Do you think that there is such a thing as a fair divorce? Does anyone win in a divorce, do you think? Look,
if you have enough money, no problem. Everybody can win. When there isn't enough money, it requires sacrifices on both sides. The reality is most fair divorces where there are limited means, where you're not going to, it means both parties walk away feeling a little bit beat up and having given, but two lawyers can construct a fair division that will not severely disadvantage one side more than the other. I mean, it really requires some give and some take. And the good part is the rules in most divorces are pretty simple. I mean, it's really not rocket science until you get into the really complicated issue. The key is not to get walked over.
Right.
So we had a podcast where we shared a statistic about the number of homeowners, or home buyers rather, which it was 17% single women compared to 9% single men. And it went viral. And it went viral because, that was the wrong camera. It went viral because men seem to think in the comments that the only way a woman could get a home was through divorce.
Okay.
So how often do you see that happen? And also what is the misconception? I think that the other part of that comment was that they did nothing to obtain the house. They really did nothing to work for the house, and they basically won it from a man.
Well, first of all, the division of assets in any divorce is simply entries on a balance sheet that are normally the community property that exists in a marriage. We have 2 columns or 4 columns. 2 of the columns are his and hers in community property, and 2 of the columns are his and hers in separate property. In the community property column, community property law requires that number be the same at the bottom. Okay. So there's an equal division of community property.
Right.
So just because someone got the house doesn't mean they got something that the other side didn't. It means they took their asset in the form of a piece of real estate while someone else may have gotten a retirement account or something like that.
Sure.
As far as what I tell clients, my advice normally is if you are going to be financially disadvantaged, a financially disadvantaged spouse afterwards, then if you can own a piece of real estate through a divorce that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get post-divorce, then absolutely hold on to that asset. But to your statistic, I have an entirely different, well, maybe it's a sexist view as well, but it's probably twisting the script a little bit. I would guess that the reason more women own real estate than men, single women, probably is, and I'm getting what I'd love to see in that statistic was the age kind of thing, because I'll bet you it has to do with maturity.
Yeah.
And I think what ends up happening, we know most women mature at a quicker rate than most men. Most men have the luxury of knowing that, you know what, if I can't afford something now, I can afford something later.
Sure.
Most men aren't as concerned about planting roots. You know, we aren't operating on a biological clock for certain hallmarks of when we need to lay down roots, get married, if we're going to get married, have children, if we're going to have children, those kind of things. Men get to live a little more of a carefree life. And I would bet that if you did a deeper dive into that statistic, that a lot of those things would bear themselves out.
Yeah.
So the idea that more women have made it a point of saying, I'm going to own a piece of real estate and actually following through with that, I'll bet that has to do with a lot of those kind of things.
Yeah.
Interesting.
We agree.
Yeah.
Oh, all right.
and I felt like even anecdotally, I mean, this again, anecdotally, like I know more men who kept the marital residence because they were in a financial position to do so than I do of women. And that's my lived experience. But I know that's probably, 6 to 1, half dozen to the other.
What's your experience with that though? And how do you, so very few people own a home outright and most working families are, definitely not of that number. So when it comes to someone, winning the house, so to speak, what does that look like in,
Well, sometimes it's like Megan's talking about. Sometimes it's, well, wait a minute. This is a house that has very little equity, so
Right.
it's expensive to live there. And post-divorce, one party is going to be earning enough to be able to do it, and the other party isn't. Sometimes there's a factor of alimony, so there's a transfer of some money from one to the other. And that may enable somebody to do it or not do it. It really, you get into some creative bookkeeping because we talked about that yin and yang thing again. If there's a longer term marriage, then one of the things you're trying to deal with in an alimony analysis is need and ability to pay. So, for example, an expensive mortgage payment, if someone wants to maintain that, increases the need for alimony. And so sometimes there's a strategic advantage of wanting to keep the house in order to build up the need for an alimony claim. But people tend to, this is where you get back into the idea of operating with just a little bit of knowledge is very dangerous. I can't tell you the number of people who believe that they can't keep the house because they don't earn enough, when the fact that they don't earn enough might be the basis for an alimony claim.
right.
Or the number of people who are afraid they're going to lose their children because they don't earn enough and they bought into some BS that someone has said, you're not going to be able to have custody of the kids because you don't make enough to support to support them.
Right.
And the reality is that's not the way it works. Child support comes into play, and there are rules to prevent, that kind of thing from happening. And very few people are ever going to lose custody of their children because they don't have the financial wherewithal coming out of a divorce.
I've heard people say that, and
People
I think
believe it.
Yeah. And I'm like, it doesn't work that way.
But that's because that's what they've heard, and their universe is very small. So if they've been told that by a financially abusive spouse, that this is what it is, and their world and their universe is that small, and they don't have an unbiased, educated, or an unbiased education to explain to them what a divorce really looks like, they go on believing that, and then they take actions based on that.
Yeah.
And oftentimes people don't find out that that's all garbage until after they've made a deal, after they're divorced, after they've made financial settlements, after they've made custody arrangements. And the problem with the way the law works is once a decision is made, it's very hard to undo it or to modify it. I mean, there are bases for modifying things.
Sure.
But that first decision is where you get more benefits of the doubt than at any other time.
Yeah.
In your decades of experience, how often have you seen alimony and child support be awarded to another party that is in significant amount to keep the marital home for one party?
It happens all the time. I mean, now, in all fairness, I deal with generally higher end cases. So I probably see it more than a lot of other folks do.
Okay.
But the reality is that the goal of the family court is to try as best they can to maintain a status quo, particularly in long-term marriages. And long-term marriages, by the way, can be 5, 8, 10-year kind of thing. It doesn't have to be 30-year marriages.
Okay.
So the goal is to make sure people are treated fairly, not to take the financially advantaged spouse and say, use that as a thumb to just kind of put the screws to the financially disadvantaged spouse.
Right.
Or the opposite way, right? I mean,
Well, that's one of the things about no fault is the idea, again, is alimony isn't used as punishment, either to punish somebody so they have to pay it or to reward somebody so they don't have to pay it.
Yeah.
Alimony is one thing I know very little about.
Do you know the percentage of people who are awarded alimony in the state of Nevada?
I don't know that there's any database to be able to tell you that because alimony, look, that's one of those areas you talked about, the way Nevada has grown. For the longest time, you could fit the entire body of case law, meaning all the appellate cases in Nevada that existed from 1864 to probably around 2000 in one 3-foot by 6-foot bookcase. I mean, it was like that was it.
Yeah.
And so there's very little law. The entire law on alimony before probably 10 years ago was a half a dozen cases, appellate cases, and one line in the statute that said the court shall award such alimony as it deems just and equitable. That's it. Now, the statute's changed, and now there are a bunch of factors that the court should consider. There's a list of like 10 or 12 factors. But the gist of it is, the earning capacity of the parties, the disparity in earnings, the length of the marriage, the financial situation, all sorts of other factors that are key to making a fair and equitable decision. And so I don't think you can put a number out there and say, 73% of whatever it is so that people believe there's 73% chance they're going to get alimony. Because if you're married 2 years, you're not going to get alimony, 73% of the time. I mean, so the reality is it depends on the number of factors. But there's an old phrase from Justice Potter Stewart, who was a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court for years. And so we often see people a lot of times say it's a lot like pornography. He defined pornography as, I can't put a definition on it, but I know it when I see it. And that's the way alimony cases get, evaluated. An experienced practitioner who does this all the time can look at a case and what the situation is, the length of the marriage, what do people earn, what's the disparity, how long are they married, who contributed to what, those kind of things. Was their education achieved during the marriage? Is someone working to their potential? Do they need rehabilitative support? All of those kind of things.
Right.
And you throw them in the blender, but an educated, experienced practitioner can look at it and say, you know what, you're on this income differential and this length of the marriage, you're probably looking at, and we can probably give you a range of numbers that's not crazy.
I'm sure it's different with every case, but is there a typical number of years that alimony is paid out?
There are what we call rules of thumb. Same thing in your business. There are all sorts of things we just, there's not a rule that says you have to bid within a certain amount, but we all know that most real estate in a hot market is going to sell for with about 97% of what the asking price is if it's priced right. And in a market that's not so hot, it might be 92% or something like that. And so in family law, we have rules of thumb. The rules of thumb are that alimony is not awarded in short-term marriages and is awarded in long-term marriages, but we don't define either of those terms.
Okay.
So generally, we know a short-term marriage is usually 5 years or less. Maybe it'll throw something at you, but not much.
Yeah.
A long-term marriage is usually 8 years or more. In that gray area, who knows? The amount of alimony or the length of alimony is usually, again, another rule of thumb, a third to half the length of the marriage.
Okay.
Now, that makes perfect sense until you get to two 60-year-olds who are getting divorced. Well, they've been married for 40 years. Does that mean somebody's going to get 13 to 20 years of alimony? No, because you're going to be capped by a lifespan of economics. People are going to be heading towards retirement. So there are going to be other things that squeeze those numbers. But in a pure sense, third to half the length of the marriage is probably fair. And people have been always trying to put in the description on the amount. You know, a lot of times we kind of all do this in our heads. We look and we say, okay, what's the differential? How is child support going to shift that? What's the differential then?
Yeah.
Maybe 30%, maybe 40% of the differential used to be that we considered taxes because the tax impact, but that changed in 2017 when alimony was no longer deductible and includable. So that throws it off. So there are all sorts of moving numbers, but most of us who do it kind of can just look at it and say, you know what? It's a lot like pornography. I kind of know it when I see it. It's probably going to be in this range.
Yeah, gotcha.
So that vindicates my usual answer is I don't know very much about alimony and you need to talk to an attorney.
Yeah, that's
It
right.
really is the truth.
Yeah.
It really is the truth.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about living in Las Vegas and practicing law here. Is there anything specific that makes the law very different in divorces for Nevada than other states, other than the timing? I know we kind of talked about that a little bit, but I mean, just even the community or the way that it operates.
So I'll give you a couple of things. The first thing is people use a phrase all the time, talk about legal separation. We mentioned it earlier with Johnny Carson. In Nevada, there is no such thing as legal separation.
Really?
There's a something called separate maintenance, which is its own little animal, which we could save for another day.
Okay.
But there's no such thing as legal separation in Nevada. And there's a reason for that. So we talked about community property, right? Community property is property acquired during the marriage from labors and efforts. There is the period that the community exists is from the time you get married until the time you get divorced. In other states, let's use California as an example. In California, the community exists from the time you get married until what they call final separation. In California, you can spend years litigating what the final separation date is. Is it the date somebody moved out? Is it the date they stopped having sex? Is it the date that they both abandoned the marriage? What happens if they went to marriage counseling after that? What happens if they got together for a weekend and, you know, happened to be in the same place, same time, and ended up in bed together? All of those impacts determine in California when the community ends. Because in California, you have the marriage beginning and community beginning, the community ending, and then they're like separate entities until the divorce is over. So in California, you have something called legal separation. Whatever point in time is going to be the hard break on when economics stop accruing to the benefit of the community for us. In Nevada, we have law that says the community continues until the judge says you're divorced and the decree is signed. So in Nevada, you can separate, live separate for a couple of years, get divorce lawyers involved, go to court for another couple of years, have custody resolved, all of these have temporary orders in place or whatever it is, and on the way to the final hearing, stop by and hit megabucks, and you may be splitting that.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So, but because of that, since the community continues till the very end, until the divorce is over, there's no such thing as legal separation in Nevada, and people use that phrase all the time.
See, I thought it was the filing date, the date that it was filed.
Nope.
No. Interesting. Okay. That's good to know.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing that's interesting in Nevada is we have this, we represent a lot of celebrities, but one of the things you learn in Nevada is this is a weird town. You go to Starbucks and, I mean, my wife used to see Andre Agassi and Steffi Graf at the Starbucks we go to, you know. It was just so we learn that these celebrities are real people who live and work among us. You know, I don't care if you own a casino or if you are on TV or whatever it is. You know what? We deal with all sorts of people, and I think more so in Nevada than anywhere else, everybody just is in this pot together. And so I think that's just one of the unique things about it. It's just fun, being able to see that they're just like us. I mean, they're real people and they have problems and they want privacy and, that kind of stuff like that. So I think that's one of those unique things about Vegas being a big city, but it's sometimes a very, very small town.
We talk about that a lot on the podcast. It's just, I say 1 degree of separation, and it is a very big little town. There's a much smaller community once you get off the Strip. And even people who work on the Strip, there's just a smaller community.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Does Nevada have a common law marriage?
It does not.
Okay.
So do we know what common law marriage is, though, right?
Well, I think in other states it's varied upon years, like 8 or 10 years together, and then you're considered common law
that's
marriage.
why I tell you, every state has, if the states that recognize common law marriage have different definitions of what constitutes common law marriage.
Sure.
So sometimes it's as simple as holding yourselves out as husband and wife. Sometimes it's doing that for a period of time. Sometimes, it's kind of a weird thing. So, Kansas has common law marriage. What if my girlfriend and I are traveling through Kansas and we stay in a hotel in Kansas and we check in as Mr. and Mrs. Smith, or Mr. and Mrs. Kainen, Have we held ourselves out as being married in a state that recognizes common law marriage? Could we then take that and say to Nevada, well, wait a minute, Nevada has to give full faith and credit to the laws of Kansas. Does Nevada have to recognize a common law marriage? That's the kind of stupid stuff that lawyers fight about.
This is what costs people money.
That's
When
what
people
costs
are
you-
like,
well-
I want to get that person because of that day we were in Kansas.
Sometimes the reason they do that is the stakes get incredibly high.
Yeah,
if all of a
sure.
sudden you go from getting nothing to maybe getting half of $20 million,
Yeah.
wait a minute, maybe it's worth taking a shot at that.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Where do you recommend people go when they're finishing the divorce process to find community, find belonging, and kind of restart?
Now, the first thing I recommend people do when they finish the divorce process is change all their beneficiaries, get a new will and trust set up. And
Okay.
all. That's
Right.
the first stop. It should be to a trust and estates attorney to get that done, because you don't want to find out when 2 years later you get hit by a bus. All of a sudden, your office insurance policy is going to your ex,
Right.
instead of your kids or something like that. I think everybody has to find their own community. Some people find it in church groups. Some people find it in, professional groups. Like I never imagined I would find community in hockey. I mean, I have become a hockey junkie.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a homebody for the most part, so I love travel. I mean, I travel a good part of the year, every year. So I take off for a month at a time, a couple of times a year. But so I genuinely enjoy spending time with my wife. We take the kids or the family along sometimes. But everyone has to find what works for them.
Yeah. How many kids do you have?
I have 3 kids.
Okay.
They're all adults. I have one of them is my daughter Rachel, who is one of my law partners.
Yes.
The other is my daughter Rebecca, who is a doctor of psychology. She's a doctor in a hospital in Milwaukee.
Okay.
Who helps children in trauma.
Okay.
And then my son Daniel, who is an aspiring DJ,
Okay.
trying to take over the world of music.
Love
Good
it.
for him. That's awesome.
Yeah. Versatile kids.
So you're hockey, so Golden Knights?
Oh, in a big way.
Yeah.
It was funny. We had a group of family lawyers.
Yeah.
We had initially there were I think 8 or 9 of us, and a couple of them were actual like real serious hockey fans. But when the Golden Knights came to town, they started selling tickets. They wanted to get a row, and so they approached me, one of the other lawyers in my firm, just because I could afford a ticket. You know what I mean? To one of these season tickets. So I was like along for the ride. And our row was like, we had 9 seats in our row and 9 different family lawyers.
Oh my gosh.
And we would swap seats and enjoy it and everything like that. We're now at 6 in the row, and it's a couple of the people, 2 of the guys moved to a different part of the stadium. Another 2 moved to, again, a different part of the stadium. And we have 6 in our row. It's I have 2 of the tickets now. My partner Neil has 2 of the tickets. And our friends Corinne and Mike, also family lawyers, have 2 of the tickets. And the great part is, like at the beginning of the season, I'm going to be traveling for, these 12 games. I immediately swap with Neil. I have 4 tickets to some games and 2 to others.
Okay.
Then Mike, we swap with Mike and Corinne. We all work together, and it really makes having those. And it's plus you're sitting with people you get to know the people around you.
It is so fun. We were just at the game on Sunday.
I was too.
And it was like, I was telling her, I was like, this has just been so good for the community. It's been so good for Vegas. The way to see people come together. And I've been to a few games, not very many, but I was like in the middle of the game texting a friend who said, you want to go next Saturday? And before I was like, well, I don't know. Tickets are kind of pricey. And I was like, get more tickets.
Yeah.
It's
a good system, the ticket sharing.
It's incredible. It really is. I feel better with the sharing them because I don't let them go to waste.
Yeah, for sure.
The games that I have 4 tickets, I take friends or I take colleagues or I take a client or I give them away to somebody who might be able to use them. A friend, another lawyer whose son had never been to a hockey game. I gave them to her. And I mean, just you get to have fun with them.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah. Well, we've taken so much of your time. Thank you for being with us today. Before we let you go, you're in an elevator with a couple, two different elevator rides. Let's set this up right, okay? So you're in an elevator with a couple who's about to be married, and you're in an elevator with a couple who's about to be divorced. What's your best advice for the people who are about to get married and about to get divorced?
I think for the people who are about to get divorced, I think the advice is talk to 2 good lawyers, because chances are, in other words, that 2 good lawyers are going to be able to work together. And even if both of those lawyers are really expensive, in the long run, if you get 2 good lawyers who can work well together, they will save money and get a better result. As to 2 people who are getting married, boy, that requires so much, so much more information. But, it goes back to, I'm a believer in marriage. So I would say, talk about the kind of thing, talk about the subjects that you've been avoiding before you start. Do some premarital counseling, figure out, we know divorces come from it's not always just the affairs and things like that.
Right.
It's lack of communication. It's how people handle money, how they handle money and value money differently. It's different core values. And so make sure you're on the same page before you just kind of, and you hate to throw water on that fire that's there at the beginning of a marriage when people are so deeply in love, but it's so much better to use that opportunity to strengthen a marriage from the get-go.
Yeah.
And risk it being too fragile to maybe not make it through that discussion than it is to find out, and the destruction that comes from finding out that you're tearing apart families and all that kind of stuff later on. So I would say have those hard discussions now, especially the ones you're afraid to have.
Yeah. I think
really good advice.
Yeah. My favorite thing that I've ever been told unsolicited from my friend Paul Buntrock, he's married to my friend Deborah, and he said to me one day, the secret to our marriage is that we respect each other. And I tell everyone that's my elevator pitch now, is love will only get you so far. And this is why people get married so easily here. And I'm like, if you only knew what that divorce process looked like, you'd really question more than your love for the other person.
No question. And the easiest thing to see when your marriage is really in trouble is really there's this one red flag that most people take for granted or they don't really pay attention to, and that's contempt. When you get to the point where you start to really hold that other person in contempt and not value them and not look at them and listen to them, where you just can't, that's the red flag that things are really kind of bad. And that's the one that's hard to come back from unless you're going to repair it very quickly.
Yeah, for sure. So my advice is give the other person a reason to always respect you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being on our podcast.
This is so great.
Yeah, so informational. Where can people find you?
Our office is located at Cheyenne and 215. Phone number is 702-823-4900, and it's KainenLawGroup.com. It's KAINEN lawgroup.com.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ed.
Thanks.